Welcome to ADF TV. My name is Frank Imphius and I'm from the Oracle JDeveloper and ADF Product Management team. So let me start with an assertion that no designer, no application developer really goes out to create applications that behave purely, don't perform at all, and don't scale. Same for Oracle ADF. So you can assume that the framework, as it is designed for performance and for scalability, which means that the default settings probably do it right based on the experience that Oracle has with the framework. However, your application is different from any other application. So there might be use cases where you need to tune your application, where you experience better performance after changing some of the settings that we enable by default. However, before you do so, be patient. Be careful not to overtune an application without knowing if there was a performance issue. So measuring performance is the key in all of tuning and performance handling. So let's have a look at the three variables that typically give you the area that you can tweak and tune applications in. So you see this triangle here, and the triangle has three variables, which is CPU, memory, and network, and that includes network latency. Now, you can choose any of two to balance the weight of your application between one of them and just shift it to the other one. For example, if you experience a problem with your memory, so if you can measure that the memory consumption, say it's up to 95%, and you want to reduce that, you could decide to maybe reduce the amount of information that you save as an object in the memory space, or just by reducing the Java Surfaces token that ADF Faces keeps, just to remember when you use the browse back button to one of the previous visited pages. So this would shift the load then to the CPU. However, the same is true between the CPU and maybe the network. So if you have a network problem and you want to reduce the load on the network, you would typically use partial submits, partial refreshes, so you would try to avoid sending big payloads to the client. So here you would just go to the cost of a CPU usage and reduce the traffic that you have on the network, just by setting some of the parameters that, by the way, are well documented in two books. There's one book about the Fusion Developer Guide, which is about ADF Business Components and all of the tuning options that you find there. Some of them I will introduce in the second recording, where I talk about ADF Business Components in particular. And there's another one, which is the overall Fusion Middleware Performance book, and there's a chapter dedicated to Oracle ADF that gives you hints and tips for all of the layers involved in ADF. For now, it's enough for you to know that if you look for performance improvements, typically, unless you can do it in hardware, you will shift the load between one of the three variables and its counterpart that you see in the triangle here. Now, performance doesn't start when you finish the application. Performance really starts at design. And the reason for this is because at design time you decide what exactly a specific view should provide, what exactly a specific functionality should query in terms of data. Now, everything that you specify at design time will have an impact to the overall performance of the page. You can imagine that querying a million of records, so unfiltered queries, will cause a lot of rendering time that it takes until the final page displays, because there's a lot of data to be shifted from the database to the middle tier and then eventually to the client. So at design time, you try to be as realistic as possible by creating predictions or requirements which are based on the user experience that you want to achieve. And these requirements that you will express in terms of performance behaviors, kind of load behavior, or how long should a query be, this is what you will specify as a minimum and maximum value, but most importantly as an average value, because the average value is what the overall user experience is. If I'm the only user on a server, then my application probably will get me to the minimum response time, whereas if I'm just on the server with a lot of other users of the same application, probably I will experience the average time. So we're very precise here. To give you an idea, the rally drivers, I don't know if you watch rally on the TV, but actually they're always sitting together, two people in one car, and there's a co-pilot, and the responsibility of the co-pilot is to know the track. So instead of just saying that there's a a curve or a turn right ahead, they give a lot more information than that. They will say, okay, this is a right turn and they will come in 600 meters. It will be downhill, it will be uphill, and you can go through it with 60 miles an hour or with 120 miles an hour. So a lot of information, very detailed information, is what the co-pilot tells the driver. Now, for your application, the performance of your application, you are the co-driver. So you have to very realistically, very in detail specify what is the expected performance that you have. And keep in mind that not all pages or view will have the same requirement for the performance. Some functionality might be less visited or less needed, and you might go away with a bad performance there, whereas there are some areas in the application where performance actually is key, it's king. So you have to come up with good performance, like a storefront. Users actually visiting the storefront, they don't accept a waiting time of 2 seconds. And there are a lot of areas in Oracle ADF that allow you to tune that, but one thing that you have to keep in mind is you have to be open-minded, and that's really the basic of everything, because a performance problem just doesn't start at the UI rendering. A performance problem could also be in the query, maybe a failed indexing on the database tables when you query data, or maybe even a router which is kind of slowing down the network. So all of these needs to be taken into consideration, and you need to have good analytics on the way to plan how you measure performance. But for the design time, you have to be clear on, is an important page that you're building, and if it is, just make sure that you don't overload it with information, because the more information you put onto a page, the longer it takes to load the page, right? So it's like a dashboard. A dashboard typically is very heavy loaded with data, with graphics and images, probably wouldn't render as quickly as a read-only table. And then in your overall development and planning, think about extra time that you need to plan in just for tuning in response to user experience or performance measuring. So don't try and tune anything before you know that there is something wrong, but however, plan time into it so that there is always some time for you to look into that. So the other aspect of tuning for sure is how to measure performance. And here it's that if you don't measure performance well enough, if you don't have a clear idea on how to measure performance, then probably the measuring of performance would screw up the results. So that means that you might end up 10 times as bad as the application in fact really is. Maybe the application doesn't have a problem here. Maybe it's you measuring the problem and then trying to fix something that really doesn't need to be fixed. So take your time and think about how to measure properly, what would be a good test scenario. Don't try to overdo it, just be realistic, and by being realistic, preparing your baseline is one of the key things that you have to do up front. Now, for a specific page that you want to test or a specific functionality that you want to test, what is the expected user behavior? Now, how would you expect users to work with that page? How would they query data? What type of data are they querying? Now, what is a reasonable payload? How many data and records they will look at the same time? How many users would you have at the same time? So all of this question needs to have an answer, and a realistic answer, not something that you make up only because that you found a way how to work with that better. So very realistically, maybe you want to bring in some users, sit in front of your application and watch them working with your application, take your notes. At an earlier opportunity, you should have that available, and you should plan this so that you can test early. So it should be tested at any possibility, or at least at any kind of sprint. So when you have a modular development, at the end of the development, you want to test this in isolation to make sure that this bit of the software, which in the end becomes the overall application, performs well. Imagine that you just bring it all together like in a pillar architecture, and then the user experience bad performance. So finding that problem area would be a lot harder than just having individual standalone testing and finding it in the module that a developer is working on. And then of course testing needs to include warm-up phases. Typically there's a warm-up phase to consider for the server, so you have to run 1 to 3 applications, restart it again. But then for your performance measurement, can you be certain that the performance will be the same if you restart the server? Or will the performance be the same if a specific task is done 5 times in a row? So all of these kind of things needs to be reconsidered and in the end measured. So that needs to be part of your testing regime. So Recognize when you run performance tests that users are not computers. Yeah, so they are not machines. Don't anticipate that the button will be pressed by 1,000 users at the same time. Even in a room full of users, if you ask them or give them the command to press the button, the one in the last row typically will have a delay of 500 milliseconds. So be very realistic on the use scenario. What is the user doing in your application? What is the data they query? When do they query it? Now, what is the typical iteration time? What are the typical conditions? Also consider logging behavior in the database. So don't try to do anything very specific to testing, which is not the reality in production, which also includes having production parameters like session expiry or compression properties being set for testing. So if you get an application out of development, chances are that some debugging options are still enabled or style sheet is not compressed. Now, if you run tests with that, then for sure your results will not be as good as it would be in production, where you switch off all of the debugging options on the ADF application. So be very careful here, don't overdo it. Think about the length of a task, think about the nature of the task, think about the number of the users that probably will use your system. And not always it's that the application performing badly because of its memory consumption or CPU. Sometimes it's just that you have too many users using your application, in which case you need to set up a second server just to handle the load. Now, question after all of this introduction, how do you test? There are several testing suites on the market. Some do JUnit tests, others do functional testing, and then you have performance testing suites. Well, you all need them. You need unit tests to make sure that your functional programming works perfect, so that all the methods that you build, even after a change, still produce the same output for the same input they did before. Functional test, of course, if you create a bounded task, you want to make sure that it performs exactly what you designed it for. So you want to have test, and as much as you can want to automate this. However, performance testing is a completely separate beast, and you want to make sure that you have analytics and you have professionals, ideally, who are very well familiar with performance measurement, looking into your application, tuning it, and first of all, measuring it. So always measuring it. If you don't know if there is a problem, how would you know that you can tune it? Yeah. So if I don't know how bad an application works, it could run, in fact, really good. So if I don't have an idea what I need to do, then tuning really becomes a tough job here. For the performance testing, there is a couple of frameworks that you can get for testing, and just for you to know, just testing the UI would be just the wrong end to start with. Typically, when you run performance tests and you discover some performance issues, you need to be on an analytic basis just exclude some of the areas of the application from being the source of the problem. So you would start with the database query, see if that runs nice. Then you will run the business service in isolation, see if that queries the data in time, and so on and so on. And eventually you hit the user interface, and then if you're aware where exactly the problem is, you will have different options to tune your application. But as said, you just tune on the if needed basis. Oracle provides a testing suite. It's the Oracle Application Testing Suite, which also works well with Oracle ADF. So you want to go to the Oracle Technology Network or just oracle.com, and under the list of products, just download the Oracle Application Testing Suite and give it a try and see how it can help you to performance test your applications that you build. This is an architecture training, and architecture trainings are not only for designers and architects, but partially also for developers. Now, what is it that developers can do? Well, developers are not considered to be experts in performance, but in the end, if they follow good coding guidelines, if they make sure that they understand the life cycle in Java server faces, if they understand which of the functionality probably will be executed twice or 3 times within a life cycle, so that they can flag that execution always has been performed. Now, that is something they could put in their code guidelines and their design guidelines, if they know how many refreshes they run, if they have an understanding of the benefits of partial refresh versus full refresh, if they have an understanding of what the payload really can cause, or if we talk about ADF Business Components, if you have a view object where you have 4 attributes, and this attribute set doesn't include salary, but in the end some of your validation logic will require salary, you will experience something called opt-in, and we talk about this in the next recording, which in fact is a per row additional SQL query. Now, if you know that this happens, then you know that if there is anything that you're related to, that you are dependent to, like for validation on the salary field, you want to query the salary field up front. So you're kind of saving the cost of additional queries. And there's so much more to know about that. However, if developers know this, then they can plan for that. They could have developer guidelines, and then they can code it correctly, which however leads us to another problem that typically we experience with developers, that is that they're trying to go for a premature optimization. And that is, as the other thing that I said, performing tuning tests or tuning measurements without having a need for it. Trying to tweak a specific functionality to run the fraction of a millisecond faster than it does right now without knowing if there is a problem. You can easily see how this would compile into a waste of time, a waste of your budget, and maybe even a waste of code lines, and maybe even make the application worse than it was before. In summary, well, there is a design aspect to performance, and that's within the developer. So that is why you're watching this, and this is why we're presenting this. So we do have 2 books, I mentioned that in the beginning, that detail how to tune view objects, how to tune application modules, and we'll talk about this in the second recording. And there's an overall performance guide for the Fusion middleware components, and there's one chapter dedicated to ADF, which also talks about things you can do on the user interface level and that you can do on the task flow level, which I talk about in the 3rd recording of this series on performance. In general, I think it's a safe thing to assume that Oracle ADF knows how to do things good. And it's also a safe to think that if you do it yourself, that probably you're not ending up with the same good results without understanding what the problem is. We understand that not everyone could hire professionals or experienced developers that do the performance test, and some of your developers will have 2 heads on their head, and one of them would be performance testing. However, try to avoid conflicts of interest. A developer who is testing his own code that he wrote probably will just go for the beaten path. Yeah? So there are a lot of things to know, and performance is a completely different section of skill and knowledge. So you want to make sure that whoever is testing is first of all independent of the code line, and second, educated on the tool and the strategy for testing the performance. So look at the overall application. As I said, be open-minded for as much as you can. Don't exclude anything as the problem. Don't exclude ADF, don't exclude the server, don't exclude networking, don't exclude the database. If you run with web service, always keep in mind that a web service as a remote data source for ADF may come with some delay, which can be due to the network, or if you use SOAP services, you might have XML as a payload, which just adds a little bit to the performance as well. Yeah, so the impact of this technology being involved, would kind of exclude you from saying, well, I want to have a page rendering within a fraction of a millisecond, which is not realistic at all. However, be aware, what is it where you get the data from? What is the overall performance in which I can get the data? Because that is the baseline of what the rendering time in the end could be. And be realistic. And that's all that we can say for an introduction. So we follow up with a second recording, which is about ADF Business Components, and then about tuning options on the user interface and task flow.